Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. Due to the pandemic, we've had to discontinue our in-person events that generated revenue, and as a result, we depend upon you for donations in order to be able to continue these webinars and to pay our Mexican staff. This is the nearly the end of the year, and so your last chance to make a tax-deductible donation. We're hoping to receive many donations. This year, we have given, this is our 41st webinar this year, and we've had a total of 49 speakers. And of course, all of that comes to you free, and we've been doing these webinars since June of 2020. We've had, this is our 121st webinar. So we hope that you will donate so that we can continue these webinars. But we don't have our usual revenue-generating programs, and so depend upon you for donations. Today's program is on social madness, an assessment of the midterm elections. The current social disorder focuses delusion and denial, the inability or unwillingness of large masses of people to distinguish between reality and fantasy and derangement. The best term to describe these Trump-encouraged processes, not wholly dissimilar to those that unfolded in Nazi Germany, is social madness. The liars come to believe their lies. For all of them, reality becomes lost, remade by fantasy. This is what Ron Aronson means by social madness. Social madness is characterized by collective denial, delusion, and derangement, and perhaps, as some fear, civil war. Ron Aronson is a social philosopher at Wayne State University. His most recent book is We, Reviving Social Hope. Among his other publications are The Dialectic of Disaster, Living Without God, New Directions for Atheists, Agnostics, Secularists, and the Undecided, and After Marxism. After his presentation, there will be the opportunity to raise questions and make comments. But for now, let's give the floor to Ron.
Thanks, Cliff. Right after the midterm elections, the thought that Americans had voted for democracy was everywhere. And there was something to that. Journalist Michelle Goldberg wrote that it was good to be brought back to reality after being taken in by the Republicans' fantasy and her own dread about the coming red wave. Turned out that she and the rest of us were protected by an unexpected barrier to the seemingly unstoppable force of right-wing rage. An effective majority voting in an election on behalf of majority rule. Despite the system's built-in weaknesses and unfairnesses, and the current blatant efforts to undermine it, including people running on the big lie, as well as strong hints of violence to come, even more clearly than in 2020, those of us on the other side belong to a majority. The majority standing in the way of minority rule in key races and in battleground states. Accordingly, the strongest responses given among a group of suburban, middle-class, mostly white seniors I discussed this with a week after the election was a sense of relief. Extremism failed, said one. Voters rejected Trump and his election deniers, said another. People want decency, said a third. Not, said another, Trump's nastiness and crazy right-wing conservatives who took away women's rights. Still, this was no time for celebration. As another person said, it was too close for comfort. Yes, we collectively may have voted for democracy, but it soon became clear that millions more, when they did the count, voted Republican than Democrat. And as political analyst John Nichols points out in this week's issue of The Nation, the anti-democracy minority now steers the Republican Party, and as he said, thanks to gerrymandering and billionaire money, they now have control of the House. More, they're part of a project. Whether we call it fascist or neo-fascist or authoritarian, to impose right-wing rule, avowedly racist, authoritarian minority rule on the entire country. This kind of discussion has been going on for a while. Certainly since the Trump campaign began in 2015, but it has shifted its urgency in 2022. As Warnock had to overcome all manner of anti-democratic stratagems to win a slim majority over an utterly unqualified opponent. The post-election task remains to build and strategize against the continuing anti-democratic movement. But while many of us rightly consume ourselves with the strategy and tactics of this partisan struggle, I'd like to pose a related but different question about the mass base of the Republican Party that stands behind their authoritarian or fascist, Trumpist, but now post-Trumpist turn. There are several things being asked today about the transformation of the Republican Party. But the most important and least discussed is about the nature of the base. Socially and economically, the MAGA base is similar to its forerunner, the Tea Party. White, largely middle class and middle income, and above all, The their most noted trait is that they came from Biden voting counties where the proportion of whites is noticeably declining. I'm talking now about the January 6th mob. The idea of the primarily white working class gets refuted by the statistical analysis of the January 6th mob. As I say, they're largely white. They're all white, virtually, middle class, professional, and they have a racial theme of the one ideological thing that they have most in common is the great replacement theory, that Democrats are bringing in non-white immigrants to reduce native-born whites to a minority. In fact, a study of those believing the big lie about the stolen 2020 election finds a strong correlation between the big lie belief and that theory, the great replacement theory. Two fictions are core beliefs of a great number of Republicans supporting whites. This is well noted and is a key piece of the identity of MAGA Republicans. Another, less discussed because it's extremely hard to quantify, is the peculiar rage propelling them. Trump touched a nerve, or better, he focused a mood of alienation that had been building for over a generation. He brought it into the open air, then gave it shape and politicized it. It was the fear of becoming a minority. This has been morphing into hatred of those other whites, educated, sophisticated, scientific-minded, who also seek political and economic changes toward a more equal society, including acceptance of gays, lesbians, and transgender individuals. Let's be clear, this is not simply a political disagreement over, for example, dividing the pie, or encouraging unions, or regulating business, or what amounts of taxes people should pay. For most of us, progressives and socialists, this still consolidating liberal majority means nothing very radical. But many Americans hate it with a passion, along with the Democratic Party they blame for it. This passion helps explain why 49% of Georgians voted for the totally inept candidate for Senate, Herschel Walker, against the minister who stands for an order that's multicultural, racially integrated, where women are the equal of men, an order which fully embraces science and public health and which seeks to curb the practices that are destroying the environment. Again, nothing very radical. But who is it that's most exercised by this threat? Among the January 6th insurrectionists, researchers found middle class, and I'm quoting from the survey, middle class and in many cases middle-aged people without obvious ties to the far right. The report on January 6th continued. They work as CEOs, store owners, doctors, lawyers, IT specialists, and accountants. Strikingly, court documents indicate that only 9% are unemployed. In other words, these people are neither economically nor socially alienated, but they were worked up enough to storm the Capitol. They frequently come from the, as I said before, Biden voting counties where the proportion of whites is declining. And ideologically, more than anything, they tend to believe the great replacement theory. Other surveys show a high correlation between racist beliefs and the big lie about the 2020 election. This conflicts with earlier reports about Trump's working class support. Studies of union members' participation in the elections in 2016, 2020, and 2022 tell us only that the votes of white union family voters were split roughly equally between Democrats and Republicans. a shift, but not an enormous shift from the past. But in any case, this accounts for only 10% of American workers, union family members. While more to the point, in all three elections, most white males, some 60% or more, now vote consistently for Trump and Republicans. In 2022, a certain share of these, a clear majority of those making $200,000 annually or more, followed the time-honored practice of the well-to-do by voting Republican. But many of the rest see themselves, to use the title of Robert Wethno's study, as left behind. The first meaning of this in today's America is geographic. Red America consists of a vast land area, 80% of American counties. With nearly half of the US population, it's strikingly distinguished by being far behind the rest of the country, economically, including technology, educational resources, and productivity, and population growth. The 20% of US counties that voted for Biden, on the contrary, with just over one half the US population, are responsible for over 70% of the country's economic activity. Deindustrializing factory towns, including small cities, declining, shrinking small towns, along with rural America in general, have been losing population to the booming areas. Those keyed into higher education, the latest technologies, and the global economy. And thus they lack many of the resources and opportunities needed to keep their young people home and attract new residents. As Wethno demonstrates, they experience the rest of America as leaving them behind. In other ways, too, the society's values are increasingly skewed away from ordinary working people without higher education, who find themselves increasingly trapped in the tyranny of merit, so-called. As much by Democrats as by Republicans, America increasingly proclaims itself as a meritocracy, whose goal is for everyone to compete on a level playing field with everyone else. What does the enormous increase in the social, cultural, and economic weight given to higher education say to the 2/3 of Americans without college degrees? Once labor unions mattered as a way for workers to assert their social and economic value to themselves and the wider society. But more and more, it seems that isolated and separated individuals have only themselves to blame for their social irrelevance. Democrats have left behind the labor consciousness that values people for their social contribution, as well as the New Deal's social democratic concern for their material and social well-being as human beings, period. As Michael Sandel points out, the flawed and dishonest belief that America can and should be a meritocracy has never been greater, and the moral and social resources for combating it are shrinking. All of this inevitably takes on a racial meaning. Although Barack Obama's success seems to testify that Americans can now rise according to their ability, most Americans simply can't. And the goal of advancing through ability and hard work imposes a tyranny of self-accusation on all those who don't. Black individual success, so important to proving to many that we're on the right track, thus provokes a feeling among many whites that something personal is going wrong. But rather than having the tools to criticize the fetish of upward mobility, or demanding policies geared towards everyone's well-being, period. In other words, constructive anger leading to, say, to a New Deal, in our racist society, many who experience themselves being left out by the meritocracy seem able only to nurture racial resentment. They're ripe for being mobilized around the belief that the others have somehow cheated. Thus, the deranged response. Obama wasn't born in the United States. Or, no less racist, take our country back. Or, putting on patriotic costumes and evoking the past. Or, even crazier, we're being discriminated against because we're white. This is the mood of whites in the Louisiana Bayou country, studied by Arlie Russell Hochschild. Waiting patiently for help from what they used to see as their government, they can only see it rather giving advantages to assertive blacks over them. They experience themselves as strangers in their own land. This helps explain why Southern white Democrats who refused to accept black equality 50 years ago left the party which was responsible for civil rights and voting rights legislation after 1965, and cultivated their resentment as Republicans opposing affirmative action and cross-district busing. 50 years later, in addition to whatever individual meetings it had for many white Americans, this individual black man, Barack Obama's presidency, also signaled a more obvious political meaning for whites. Obama was elected by a majority made up of whites, blacks, other minorities, and of young people comfortable voting for the Democratic Party, but not the increasingly white conservative Republicans. Worse, demographic trends showed whites becoming an actual minority by the 2040 or 2050 US Census. Their children are already a minority in the public schools. Outnumbered, left behind, that's the experience of these political and demographic changes that help explain why so many whites found their way to Trump. But there's more. Further, among the many who have been left behind in building up resentment about their treatment and the country's direction is a distinct and coherent group of white Americans, always mentioned by the way, but rarely given the central appropriate attention that they're entitled to: evangelical Christians. In a sense, rather than being left behind, they took themselves out of the mainstream by design. They have a long history in America, especially in the South, supporting first slavery and then segregation, opposing evolution and other forms of modernity. They expanded in numbers significantly in response to the 1960s. And by the 1980s, becoming the majority of white Christians, they entered politics determined to reshape the country as the mass base of the Republican Party. In addition to the economic and racial reasons for resentment I already mentioned, evangelicals were always opposed to the women's movement, homosexuality and gay marriage, modern science, especially evolution, and secular education that undermined the absolute authority of the Bible, as interpreted by their ministers. And by the 1970s, they discovered themselves in opposition to abortion. All of these oppositions to modernity as we know it are pretty significant, but a no less deep source of resentment is just living in secular America, where, as we've just seen during the pandemic, the default authority of scientific reasoning imposes constant demands and humiliations on those thinking otherwise. None of us may be intentionally disrespectful, but the facts themselves are disrespectful. They say your literal biblical-based belief is irrelevant during our public health crisis. Similarly, in the university culture that has become essential to our society, and even more to its meritocracy, there's virtually no space left for evangelical dogma. 81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump in 2016, 76 in 2020, and now 83% for Democrats in 2022. In the southern state of Georgia, 1/3 of the runoff voters were white evangelicals. And 88% of them voted against Reverend Warnock and for Herschel Walker. Last week, they formed the clear majority of the Republicans who voted. While in the presidential elections, they made up no less than 40 and as many 45% of Trump's voting base. They and the high earners are Trump's two core groups. For those who are well off, support for Republicans has always been understood and is above all transactional. But the rest, what is moving them? Last week, one writer spoke of the enormous hatred for Democrats that must have been needed to produce so many votes for a Herschel Walker. Hatred fits the many resentments I've been discussing. The deep sense of grievance mobilized by Trump and still motivating people today. As I've said, it's not what we usually understand as the focused and rational anger of workers on strike, or the kind of confident and rational anger, kind of confident, determined anger we saw among Black South Africans against apartheid. Its hate speech and threat of violence come from rage, which feel bottomless. At the root of this resentment and sense of grievance is a fundamental feeling of impotence. Yes, journalist Will Bunch says in the Philadelphia Inquirer, never in our lifetime has the hate speech been so open and so over the top, nor has the threat of political bloodshed felt so palpable. Why is this? Bunch observes, focusing on the anti-Semitism, the homophobia, the violence. This isn't the American right flexing its muscles out of strength. Quite the opposite. The forces of 400 years of white supremacy culture are like a wounded bear right now, lashing out and extremely dangerous because its proponents know that they are a seriously endangered species. Bunch might have said dying bear. Endangered culturally, endangered historically, endangered demographically. For racist whites or evangelical Christians, there's no way out. For those white Christian America who continue denying racial integration, diversity, and modernity, who see themselves becoming a minority, Trump himself showed the way out. He demonstrated that there are two outlets. One is imposing minority rule, and the other is becoming increasingly irrational. These two directions intermingle and are constantly manipulated by the leadership of the Republican Party. Stop the steal has been the watchword of the focused political electoral project of minority rule, as is election integrity, and whatever Carrie Lake is currently mouthing. At the same time, we see an endless variety of manias stirring the grassroots. Not only white Christian nationalists, but anti-gays besieging library boards and anti-critical race activists besieging school boards, from 2020 holdouts to anti-vaxxers and anti-maskers, from open carry Second Amendment true believers to anti-abortion, anti-gay, and anti-trans activists, all pointing sooner or later to the growing cult of QAnon. Sometimes the country seems to be going crazy. At other times, we struggle against that to successfully mobilize enough people to make up a majority against minority rule, which we've just done. So far, so good, we might say, after the midterms. But we know that the issues are too deep, the racist and anti-modern forces are too many with strong roots to be easily defeated or to simply surrender or go away. Given my analysis of what we're seeing on the right, there's no easy solution. It'll take battle after battle after battle. For the moment, our slogan should be, democracy means majority rule. Thank you. I can take comments and questions now.
Okay. If you have a question and are watching on YouTube, you will have to send us your question or comment by email to global justice Cliff at gmail.com. And I will then pass that question or comment on to those in the Zoom room. And those who are in the Zoom room, of course, can raise your question directly. So Cliff at gmail.com. Yeah, so just, and I will then pass that question or comment on to those in the Zoom room. Okay, so who has the first question or comment? Larry Harris.
Yeah. Thanks, Cliff. Everything you say makes complete sense to me, but the question I keep asking myself is that we're talking about an election in which the turnout by American standards was high, but was still under 50%, let's say. What do we make of the people who didn't vote? Do they not care? What do you imagine would have been the result of the election if everyone had voted?
Well, we ask ourselves that question, don't we, after every election? And the problem is the percentages go up slightly, but never approach 80 or 90%. And we wonder about all those people who don't vote. One thing we can say is the what if. What if elections were conducted on Sunday, or what if the election Tuesday was a national holiday? Would that drive up the vote? And then how would it seem? I think the general feeling, which is just a speculation, isn't it? Unless maybe there have been studies of the non-voters, because they tend to be non-responders, probably the polls as well. Yeah. But are the non-voters pretty much the same as the voters? That's your question. Or do they represent which kind of group? Those who are going to be more liberal, more accepting of minorities and so on, or are they going to be more alienated and angry? And it's a good question. What we should probably do, I should probably do this because it's a crucial question, is have a look at what survey research has said about it. But aside from that, you know the same answer I know, which is we don't know at this moment. We wish we knew.
Yeah.
There is, I should say one further thing, which is an important piece of this. It's not only an American tradition, the right to not participate, but we're in a world that is increasingly more individualistic, in which people increasingly go through their lives not relating to the larger picture. And that is something that has perhaps intentionally on some part and systemically on other part pulled people away from participation, from the citizenship activism. The French social philosopher Francis Janson talked about citoyenization. He invented the term citizenization.
Right.
What the society should do, and he was talking about France in the 70s and 80s. What the society should do is create encouragements for people to participate. But the problem is, of course, if people can be so isolated and so consumerist oriented that it's part of the what I've written about as it's the individualization or the privatization of social hope. People live increasingly privatized lives. So it's somewhat different in other countries, but I mean, it seems to us as if how could anybody not notice what's going on and taken a position about it in the last 10 years. And still, you're right.
Yeah.
In Tennessee, the voting percentage was 35. In West Virginia, both. Now, they didn't have the kind of questions that happened in Michigan, for example, where we had maybe 60% of the people voting.
Yeah, it's always been a mystery to me how so many people can not care about that, and at the same time care passionately about who the next host of Jeopardy is going to be. You know,
Or the winners of their favorite football team's game.
Yeah.
Right? I know. But I bet you that's a question you probably could ask and probably have asked at other times because it's a crucial question.
Thank you.
It seems to me that most of the non-voters are simply disillusioned with the political process. Those who who vote for Trump, most Republicans are anti-establishment. They see Trump as not part of the establishment, but that's where a good deal of his support came from, and that's where the most of the Republicans are at, and they feel they have good reason to feel disillusioned because under neoliberal globalization, they have have had their social position jeopardized. Status anxiety is one of the things that motivates much of the right wing today.
I've written a paper called, the title is The Privatization of Hope. It's published, you can find it at the Boston Review. It's an analysis of this trend of people, and there are a number of reasons for that trend of people disconnecting themselves from any kind of sense of responsibility for involvement in the political process. That was published as part of my book, Reviving Social Hope. Notice the title, Reviving Social Hope, because these are people who have given up social hope, have become cynical, have drawn into themselves, and so on and so forth.
Let's see. I see Danny Postal's hand.
Mark Ginsburg had his hand up first, so why don't we go with him?
Okay, Mark first.
Ron, thank you very much for your analysis today, but also other things that you shared in writing. The one contradiction, the non-participation, of course, has been the what I think are primarily evangelical Christians who maybe even more so on the local level, school boards and similar kinds of local political units have been very active. And my question is, what can you tell us about how they get the message primarily? I mean, we know about social media, we know about some of the TV channels and radio, but you mentioned briefly the religious leaders in their local groups. What do we know about how strong that message is, how consistent it is, and B, how it's taken up by the members of those groups.
Yeah, there's been a bit of study of many of those groups, and in their leadership, going back. Francis Fitzgerald, who wrote a stunning book about Vietnam, wrote a book. I think the title is simply the Evangelicals, which was a massive study of the fairly brief history from the 70s through recently, just about Trump, of these of the churches and their members, and a lot of things need to be said about them. More tight-knit communities than generally among the anomie and alienation and cynicism generally, and consumerism generally in American society. That's one piece of it. Another piece was they came out of a kind of decades-long withdrawal. If you go back to the famed Tennessee case on evolution, the Scopes trial, there's in a sense a certain cultural withdrawal of evangelical groups for a number of years, at least 20, 30 years. And in that process of withdrawal, they never stopped growing, they never stopped organizing, they never stopped teaching, but they weren't trying terribly hard to have an effect on the larger culture. And a few things happened simultaneously. One was the movement of millions of Southern workers to the West Coast, a Southernization of America, the West Coast, and places like Detroit, where the social withdrawal of largely the Southern states was ended as these folks moved out. And we remember when Southern California, particularly Orange County, was a right-wing bastion. People of that kind of fierce anti-modern religion moved. They may have moved individually, but they formed themselves into communities wherever they were. And you could see it in a place like Detroit, and you could see one piece of it was the general rejection of integration. And if you did a survey of Detroit working class whites, you would find half were fiercely opposed to racial integration, and half were pretty strongly accepting of it as well. So it wasn't simply a racist bloc, but that racism was part of what tended to move around the country with them, even if it already existed in other places. That's one piece of it. But the other piece of it is the reaffirmation, strong reaffirmation of the dogmatic roots of the inerrancy of the scripture. We believe the scripture word for word, and we reject anything that that violates that. The word violate probably fits here. And it's a tight-knit group that was anti-modernist values, anti-secular, anti-liberal Christian. So that's another piece of it. And it came into focus a number of times. One of them was, of course, with the cases against the teaching of evolution. Not just Scopes, but in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, organizing against it. Now, if you were to look at a public opinion poll, you'd find some 35% of Americans reject evolution. Now, where do they reject it? Where do they get that from? Well, if they get some public school teaching about evolution in their schools, it is taught as a theory among other theories, namely creationism. And most of those folks don't go on to higher education in a modern secular university. Some do and quarrel with the science education they get. But you have a core. Before Trump's election, I thought to myself, Well, there are 35% of Americans who I know will follow the lead of their denominations, which are generally Southern Baptist. And those Southern Baptist denominations came out for Trump. But it was not 35%. It turns out it was 46% because a lot of other people. There were, of course, the $200,000 and above Republicans and traditional Republicans and other disaffected, alienated people, which swelled into enough to get him elected. But at the core, were these very alienated evangelical Christians who, as I say, feel disrespected, not by you or me, but by the culture and the society itself and the values, and felt strongly disrespected during the whole period of the height of the pandemic. Being told, they don't mind being told what to do, it seems to me. They mind being told what to do by a secular, scientifically minded government, which is imposing public health standards on them. So there is a real solid, dense culture there. And where are they learning it? Well, it's in local areas and in local communities and in local churches. If you were to look in the southern counties, and people have done county by county studies of the American South, and the places with the highest, this is an additional fact, the highest density of slavery, also today, in the past, highest density of slavery in the past, today has the highest density of conservative Republicans. So there is a connection with slavery and then segregation and then conservatism. It's a little piece of the story, but it's a very important story, and a story we don't know enough about. And I say it's extremely important because they have a powerful effect. Now, what people are now saying, for example, Michelle Goldberg said in the Times about a year and a half ago, and I've written the same thing. As history seems to be now, withdrawing from history was one thing. Withdrawing from modernity was one thing. Withdrawing from larger America was one thing. But then in the 80s, there's a decision, Ronald Reagan as a key turning point, to have an influence on and take over America and be ruling. And that's failed. Trump gets elected on the failure of that project. What do I mean failure? Barack Obama, despite his professions of religious faith, a very secular president, who was the president of this modernizing majority, and the sense with, for example, the Supreme Court allowing gay marriage, a sense that the shit has hit the fan. Now, what we've tried to do has failed. And it's really a backlash thing that's happened with the Dobbs decision, the reversal of Roe v. Wade. And a lot of people have seen that. That's what Will Bunch is talking about. This is the wounded bear, feeling they are not a majority. They are not able to create a majority. They are in the minority. And from that comes the Republican project, minority rule. Thanks.
Okay, Danny, you're next.
Okay, thanks. I'm glad that Mark's question went right before mine, because mine follows to some extent from his. And I'm sorry that I had to join late, so I missed the beginning, Ron.
I'll send it to you. It's written.
Excellent. I had some work commitments that didn't allow me to join the meeting until just now. But what I wanted to say was, along the lines of what Mark was saying about the evangelicals, I think your analysis about engagement, disengagement, privatization, people feeling disconnected, I think that that might be, there are two levels here. There's the macro level, long-term structural process, which is undeniably what you're describing. But I don't think that it actually applies all that well to the specific case of Trumpism. There's a lot of evidence that Trump supporters, especially the most hardcore of them, actually have felt quite activated, engaged, part of something larger than themselves. In fact, in your essay on social madness, you talk about this. There's a positive, if you will, as hard as it is for people with our politics to imagine this. There's actually a very positive emotional dimension to the Trump experience when you attend a Trump rally, when you get involved with this movement. It's not simply about the hatred, the resentments, the demonization of others. It certainly is about those things, but it's also about this feeling of reclaiming something as contorted and disfigured as this might seem, as much of a case of false consciousness as we may see it as being. The fact is that on a subjective, affective level, many people in the Trump world feel that they are actually engaged in something deeply meaningful. There are, William Mozzarella has a brilliant essay about this, using psychoanalysis to describe what he calls the enjoyment factor of Trumpism. What makes Trump so enjoyable for his supporters? It's not just hatred. It's also, there's a feeling of joy. Sometimes those are not mutually exclusive categories. It's fun to hate. It's fun to demonize. So this is a very dark, swampy terrain that we're entering into here. And I guess what I want to say, and you're aware of this, Ron, I'm quoting you back to yourself. You've written about this in your own essay. But what I'm trying to suggest is that this problematizes the macro picture that you're drawing, because the assumption, I think, in the story that you're trying to tell is that if only people were more engaged, if they were less disengaged and more engaged, then we would have more progressive and humanistic outcomes. I don't think that's a safe assumption. I think that exactly what Mark was saying, evangelicals and the way they're mobilized, they're highly mobilized. They're some of the most active Americans, actually. If you use those sort of Robert Putnam indices of engagement and civic participation. The Trump people feel more, the William Mozzarella quotes somebody who says, "I have never felt such an intense emotional connection to a political figure as I do about Trump." There is a deep sense of activation, animation, and I think that the assumption, Ron, that if only people were more active, we would have better outcomes is simply faulty.
Yeah.
Maybe we have to look deeper into the darkness here. Maybe more activation can lead to fascism. Fascism is a form of activation. It's not a question of activation or passive or disconnection. It's a question of the nature of the activism, the nature of the participation. So I just want to throw that out there to both problematize the narrative that you're suggesting, and also to propose that we take a deeper, more sobering look at the darkness that we're dealing with here.
Okay, so how can I disagree with you, but completely agree at the same time, which is our interaction, I suppose, allows for.
That characterizes our conversations going back years.
Yeah, years. Look, people are left behind. That's the theme through my talk, with the various left behinds in America that Trump is playing on, and that this fascistic movement is building on. But that left behind is not left behind as individuals. It's culturally left behind and socially left behind. People living in place in parts of the country that are left behind by other parts of the country geographically. You can actually You can plot it as you know. You take the counties that voted Biden and the counties that voted Trump. You get a red map, a huge red map, and then the blue map of the 500 counties out of 3,000 in the country. They're left behind collectively. That's what Arlie Russell Hochschild is expressing in her Strangers in Their Own Land. And I want to stress that what I have to connect further is what that individual alienation and privatization of hope is about and how that fits in this. But for the moment, what I'm concerned mostly is picking up on what you've said. Trump at his rallies expresses love for his supporters, and they express love for him, and he uses that word. And one of the key things that's going on at those rallies is he gets them and they get him. That's why it ain't going to happen in a similar way with DeSantis. And some people have understood, you just making it a simple transactional thing where DeSantis replaces Trump. No, that's not the movement. And it's not just a Trump movement. It's a certain current among people of belonging together in that struggle. Absolutely right. Trump understands their anger, their rage, their alienation, and he exploits it, and it's in a communion with them that this is going on. So I think we have to see that that's when people think about a fascist movement, they don't necessarily stress, but they should stress the way in which people are bound together in this process, the way in which people go out on open carry together and they carry their weapons into and they want to freak people out, but they're doing it as a group. People are not doing it as individuals. So
Exactly.
So there is, there's something going on here. Similar, you might say, to a hanging in the South, where the
Exactly.
community gathered and applauded the Black man who was being strung up. Not applauded him, applauded each other for doing this.
They turned them into picnics. Those were
that's right.
occasions. They took photographs.
That's right.
They sent these postcards to their family members and said, look at this. This is the collective experience.
Right. The lynching is a collective experience. That's right. And that's crucial to this whole current. When people go to school board meetings, they go together and they're trying to have a collective effect. If you've ever been as a member of a left group going to a meeting to protest, and you have that collective experience of stopping what's going on and of being listened to, that's what people have at the school board meeting as disruptors, or the library board meeting. So I totally agree with all of that.
That feeling that they're not in it alone.
They're not in it alone. And Trump, see, the ordinariness of Trump and the fact that he does not seem to be, in some way, he's not educated, he's not polished, and so on. There's a quality to him which people can identify with. You can't identify with Obama. Sorry. Obama's too smooth, too cool, too educated, too well-spoken. He's not like me, even if he were white. But Trump, no. Trump is sort of hangs out there. And the entertainment is part of it. He's chatting to his folks. He's interacting with them.
You know what, David Frum made this point that you're making right now, Ron, very, somebody I almost never quote, but David Frum was talking about the DeSantis-Trump fissure that seems to be emerging. And he said, the difference between these two is that Trump is an authentic American phony. And DeSantis is a phony American phony. And Trump supporters know that he is a snake oil salesman and a pathological liar and exaggerates and is a carnival act. But he is also, there's something about the way he lies, the way he orates, the way he generates emotion that seems authentic to people. He talks like a person you might know
That's
would
right.
talk. And DeSantis doesn't and can't.
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
But if I could just put one last point on this, Ron, and then I'll be quiet. The left behind category that you're using, let me just suggest, and I know that you don't mean it necessarily in a narrowly financial or economic or class sense, but let me just throw out there the fact that there has now been a massive empirical study of the class and economic profiles of the participants in the January 6th insurrection.
Right. I referred to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, actually, we talked about it. So that if you've already referred to it, then everyone else in the room knows. But the income level of
Yes.
the January 6th people was extremely high. These are six-figure salaries. Some of them are CEOs. They are accountants. They are business owners. They are in the, if not in the 1%, some of them certainly were. All of them, almost all of them, were in the top 5 to 10%
Yeah.
of the income. So how does that fit in with the idea of left behind? I mean, you'd really have to stretch the concept of left behind. And this is not just January 6th. We have data about the average income of your Trump supporter is actually higher than the average income of the Biden voter and of Hillary Clinton voters. So this problematizes the the purely economic or class element of
Right.
left behind. If we
Right.
stretch the concept of left behind to mean, oh, well, we feel like our idea of America, we've been left behind because America is changing demographically, then we have to think through this concept of left behind, of alienation, strangers in our own land, in a way that goes way beyond economic class, because it's clearly not about that. And I would go even further. I would say that those leftists who are so fixated on the pure class dimensions of Trumpism are totally missing the
Right.
heart and soul of the phenomenon.
Right. Right. So I agree with the last point. I would say the interesting piece of information, which is gathered in some elections, some polling, exit polling, is when they tag people at 50,000 and over, 100,000 and over, and it's slightly more the higher you go for Republicans over Democrats. But when you get to 200,000 and over, it's 60% Republicans, 40% Democrats. It resumes the old story. Part of what I was saying is there's an old story here. And the old story is those people who always voted Republican once you get into a certain economic, social bracket. Now, what does that say about Trump supporters? And that to me, that has to be studied more. The Trump supporters at the highest ranges. Certainly, there has always been that Republican and anti-popular, anti-ordinary people, anti-people mixing with each other, anti-modern values piece of the upper classes. And someone has to do that study, it seems to me, which is what you're posing. What is the upper class Trump supporter who's willing to be a rioter on January 6th? How do you connect that up? But I think that's a key a key project for understanding. And
I agree. I think that the bottom line is that the through line is race. It's about racism.
Yeah. We come back to race, and we come back to race, which is, as I was developing, you missed that point, but you know it from my other writings, that race is key at each step of the way. It's key each step in the analysis of how these people come together and why they come together. And this simply takes us back to the underlying theme of American history. You know, we haven't left it behind. That's why I quoted Will Bunch talking about the 400-year history. And these people are like the wounded bear suffering under the 400-year history about to be reversed, but irrationally striking out because of it. Yeah.
Are there any other questions or comments? Well, if not, I want to thank Ron for a very informative and interesting discussion. I hope our audience enjoyed it as much as I did. And I thank all of you who contributed to the discussion. Today's webinar, as well as past programs, are available on YouTube, accessible from our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. And I hope that you will take this opportunity to make a donation, an end of the year tax deductible donation. As we've been speaking, Mark Ginsburg has made a donation. Thank you, Mark. And I hope that others of you will do so as well. Finally, I want to thank our webinar team who made this possible. Liz Mestris, Gregory Diamant, Roberto Robles, Olivia Canales, Bob Stone, Betsy Bowman, and myself, Cliff Duran. I hope you'll join us next Monday for our webinar featuring Andres Ruggieri, Between Self-Management and Precariousness. And now, this is Cliff Durand signing off until next Monday.